Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to docket number 240802, the Annual Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program Review, year 4. We are here this morning for our first technical meeting of the season in this docket. My name is Chairman Marissa Gillette. I'm joined virtually today by my colleagues, the Vice Chairman Jack Bukowski and Commissioner Michael Karen. We have an agenda in front of us today, starting with a presentation from our colleagues at Eversource and UI, followed by a presentation from Tesla and Connector. After each set of presentations, we are going to pause for questions first from authority staff. Time permitting, we will allow questions from other stakeholders, and we'll proceed like that. If this is your first time joining a PURA technical meeting remotely, just a few housekeeping matters for your attention, please. If the presentations were filed in advance, we can ask Ms. Lupoli to display them when it's time, or it's up to you if you'd like to share the screen yourself. We are transcribing today's technical meeting with a court reporter. So we ask that you make sure you are identifiable by name and affiliation for clarity of the record. If we do have time for stakeholder questions, then we will use the queue. So the raise hand functions under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. We do not enable or allow the chat function during these technical meetings, as that is not part of the official record. So we ask that you refrain from using that. Any questions or comments will have to be vocalized. We are anticipating wrapping up by noon today. The authority has another matter this afternoon, so we are going to stick strictly to the agenda that has been published in advance. So with that, I'm going to welcome to the virtual stage our colleagues from Eversource and UI. I'll get the first presentation pulled up. And assuming that you all are going in order, I think we have our rate setting team up first. Welcome you. And we will turn over the virtual floor.
Good
Hi,
morning.
my name.
Go
Go
ahead,
Brian.
Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Julia Danahy, a program manager at Eversource for the RS program. I believe we actually have the deployment level data first. If we could do next slide, we kind of have our agenda up. So we do have slides prepared for each of the agenda items for this meeting. So the deployment data, the data reporting platform, the approval timelines, and then the summary of written comments, including the rate setting. We did also prepare a slide for an additional topic, but we are happy to present on that if there's time, and otherwise I'm happy to table it for written comments or a future technical meeting. All right, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so here we have the Eversource deployment data. So this is the applications received through May of this year for all months of the program. So you can kind of see here that the application volume has leveled off a little bit in 2024, but we are still definitely exceeding the program deployment goals per year. Next slide, please. And then this is the same information for UI. So the application received from the start of the program through May of this year. And I should also note, we have this kind of broken out. You can see the volume by adders as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then next, this is the Eversource data for systems actually deployed. So projects that were interconnected in each of these months from the program start through May of this year. And again, we have the breakouts by adder as well. It kind of tells a similar story. It has leveled out a little bit from our highest volume, but we are definitely exceeding those goals, which is great. Next slide, please. And then the same information for UI. So systems deployed, broken out by adder through May of this year. And this information too is all filed if people kind of want to see a more granular view of it. This is directly from our filing from the 15th. Next slide, please. And then we did want to call out specific attention to the adder participation. So this is similar information, so it still is the projects that were deployed over the same period by month, but this kind of zooms in on those adder participation levels. So this one is for Eversource, and then on the next slide we have UI. And again, this information is in that same 715 filing. All right, next slide, please. I think that kind of covers our overall deployment numbers. And then we have Mr. Rice is going to present on the centralized data reporting platform.
Thank you. And we can go to the next slide. So Pura had asked the EDCs to provide an update on the status of having RS program data on the Pura data dashboard, which was first built to meet requirements related to energy affordability programs. So the as an initial matter, we'll confirm that RS program data continues to be available on the respective EDC websites. It's really provided in a form of, it's fairly simple and accessible, 3 downloadable Excel workbooks. There's about 9 total sheets across those workbooks. And then this is maintained substantially with existing EDC resources, web team resources, communications, and RS program staff. So we have actually a meaningful update because what the EDCs discovered as they worked with the vendor that was selected through a competitive RFP to originally build the dashboard. And again, first building it to meet requirements laid out in the energy affordability docket, is that the costs to expand that dashboard to include RS program data would be a significant expenditure. I can't talk specific costs because it was a confidential bid at this time, but certainly relative to the incremental cost of essentially nothing that's being incurred to make RS program data available on EDC websites, having that data available on the Pura data dashboard would be significant. So before the EDCs proceed with that and kick off that vendor and incur those costs, we're taking time to investigate if there are lower cost approaches that might be available. Once that fact finding is concluded, kind of the EDCs will assess where things stand. And I don't think we're ruling out the possibility that we would, take the opportunity in some form to apprise Pura of what the ongoing costs of expanding the Pura data dashboard would be before we proceed with kicking off a vendor and incurring those costs to expand the dashboard. We hope to kind of complete that fact finding kind of in the next several weeks. So a further update could come then. And then kind of regardless of when we kick off new work, the expectation is once the decision on a path forward is reached, it would be completed within a time frame of several months to have data migrated onto the Pura data dashboard. And again, I'll conclude by just reiterating that this data is available. The EDCs are updating it regularly. It's just a matter of where it's available. Right now, it's on the respective EDC websites. It's also filed in the annual review dockets. So the next step that we're focusing on is just making that data available as part of the centralized Pura data dashboard. All right.
Okay, so the next agenda item was the interconnection application and approval timelines. Next slide, please. So these are the Eversource interconnection application and approval timelines for Q1. So this is from order 14 filed on 5/1, and then I will point out we'll be filing Q2 information if people are interested on 8/1. So these numbers are in business days and kind of cover the different phases of the application. So from submission to approval, both for our review, and then the full timeline includes any kind of back and forth if there are follow-ups with the installer. And then the conditional approval and work order issuance following that RS approval, we have that timeline. And then the meter installation timelines, both for projects that are able to install that meter the first time versus projects that require in-field corrections. And then the last row is that meter installation to PTO timeline. And then I think we can move to the next slide, which is UI's data. And I believe Mr. Hernandez is going to speak to this one. I will say the UI data, this kind of shows a lot of the same information. This is also for specific to Q1, and then they will be filing the Q2 data kind of at the end of the month. But you can see there's a similar breakout. I think they have some additional fields on here. For example, the fees, whereas Eversource fees, now that they're collected within PowerClerk, there's kind of no timeline associated with payment processing. But otherwise a similar breakout of the timeline.
Thank you, Ms. Denny. Yeah, I had a little trouble with the
Thanks.
mute. But yes, it covers the same timeline milestones. And again, from the final issuance, from the time that the application is received to permission to operate, totaling 81 days, as Ms. Denny's indicating. Thank you. You can
Thanks.
move on to the next slide, please.
Yep. All right, so then next is the summary of the topics from the written comments filed on June 24th. So next slide, please. I believe this starts with rate setting. So on this slide, we kind of cover some of the data points that are involved in the rate setting calculation. So system costs, we kind of used March as just kind of an example to point out the trends from year to year. So we have actually seen the cost per watt increase over the life of the program, as you can kind of see here. And then other fields that are involved, so the ITC in 2025 will remain at 30%, which is the same as this year. The EDCs do not collect O&M costs, so do not have kind of data to provide for those. But we were able, now that the program has been running for a couple of years, we were able to calculate the average capacity factor based on actual production data for our RES systems, and both EDCs found that to be right about 14%. Next slide, please. And then kind of involved in the rate setting category, we have the tariff modeling. So the EDCs actually would recommend that PURA consider adjusting that model to respond more to deployment levels than to the reported cost per watt. We kind of did show the data indicates that the cost per watt in Connecticut is increasing, which is different from kind of nationwide PV pricing. So it's possible that there is some level of the incentives contributing to that price increase and kind of what customers are willing to pay for going solar. So we feel that basing that on the deployment levels would be a good development, and then also a way to kind of maintain the goals of that orderly development of the renewable resources. Next slide, please. All right, and then now we're into the metering section. So we have Patrick Pham on the line for Eversource to speak to these slides. And then we have a UI representative as well.
Hi, good morning. So for the tribe type connections, we did work with some of the developers on coming up with some alternatives for metering multifamily homes. One of the things that we proposed were alternatives for metering services that were 400 amps and below with groups of 6 meters or less. Anything greater than that does need to follow the IRNR book, but we came up with some alternative solutions to help alleviate some of the concerns and struggles that developers were having with procuring multi-position sockets. So for anything that is 400 amps or below, we have proposed a tap box solution, and we met with Ion Pros Con SSA on some of these proposed solutions, and actually have a Word document that we circulated with them on this. If you go to the next slide, please. So currently, we are allowing the dual riser option. UI is currently allowing this for all services. At Eversource, we're allowing this for the remainder of this year, and we'll reevaluate the lead time for multi-position sockets. This was a design that was used initially and will continue to use for the end of this year. There's nothing that needs to really be done in terms of the program to implement this, as this was something already implemented. So we've communicated this with developers that this can be used. Next slide, please. Another option that we proposed is to use a fused disconnect or a disconnect that would feed into single position sockets. This can be used for an overhead or underground service. We do have some guidelines around this, which is to keep this installation safe. One of the things is that the load side of that disconnect should be terminated for each meter. So there's no tap boxes or anything of that sort. But the advantage of this design is that the developer can purchase single position sockets, which are easier to procure, in addition to a disconnect that can branch out to those to each socket individually. Next slide, please. And for overhead services specifically, we have been allowing a tap box, a pre-bust tap box that has terminations inside of it. The idea being that that tap box would be mounted close to ground level. It's lockable and sealable to help prevent any tampering. And the box itself should have terminals to feed each individual meter socket. Next slide, please. On MSAs, we have been working with Connect DER and Tesla on the implementation of this. We do have safety concerns that are still in play that haven't been addressed yet. With the implementation of MSAs, and this was explained in one of our earlier working groups, it does limit our ability to do a lot of the things that we currently do. One of the major hurdles that we have is the ability to operate a lever bypass. A lot of these concerns were outlined in Order 32, but one of the things that we did mention is if the authority were to mandate this, we would want some approval from the state electrical inspector. The approval would consist of the models that were discussed as part of Order 32, nothing additional. The approval needs to be, or the implementation of this needs to be discussed with all the stakeholders as well. The implementation of an MSA does hinder our ability to do the work that we do day to day, specifically exchanging meters in a lever bypass socket. We're unable to install voltage recorders, unable to perform any theft of or analysis of a troubleshooting of a service. With the MSA installed, it is a customer-owned device, so we are not going to be handling that device or removing that device at all. The device is meant to be left in the socket, and the only thing that we would be doing, if given approval, would be exchanging that meter, but the safety concern is still there on pulling a meter under load, which has not been our practice for the past 20 years for new services. The alternative that is currently being allowed is that we do allow MSAs to be installed on a separate meter socket, and I have a picture on the next slide. And we also do allow load side connections inside meter main compartments. Go to next slide, please. So this is an example of an installation with an MSA feeding in separate individual compartment. The MSA is installed in the meter socket at the bottom right. The Eversource meter is installed on the left-hand side. And the ability or the advantage of this installation is that if a customer were to call with any concerns of flickering lights or voltage complaints, we could get into the socket easily and investigate that complaint. With the MSA installed, we would require the customer to remove that device, which would essentially require them to hire an electrician to remove that and have us come back on a repeat visit. But this installation is currently allowed for MSAs. And next slide, please. This is also another design that is currently permitted, which does simplify the installation for solar. We do allow a load side tap on the bottom of a meter main compartment that can go to the inverter. On the left-hand side, there's use of connectors or bugs. On the right-hand side, there's an additional breaker used for the PV, all using the existing equipment that's out there. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Mr. Pham. Just wanted to talk about alignment for solar for all requirements. The EDCs are looking forward to working with Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and others, including Sunbridge, to align on these types of opportunities. The existing working groups too could be leveraged, such as the multifamily affordable housing working group, to increase the efficiencies in these coordinated efforts. The EDCs too would be willing to and could make field changes to Power Clerk to have some tracking of these project types for these allowable incentive opportunities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, we didn't know we took up this this issue and regarding the HES. I don't know if that's something we want to discuss at this point.
Sure, you can go ahead, Mr. Hernandez.
Oh, sure, thank you. Well, as mentioned, the HES participation level requirements, there are certain challenges going on that warrant further discussions, potential changes and alternatives. These include a meaningful portion of RS customers have canceled scheduled HES appointments following RS approval. RS customers are less likely to pursue efficiency measures as non-RS HES participants. And HES requirement continues to be the major reason some of these applications are returned for corrections. Notwithstanding the fact that the HES budgets and timelines are strained due to their high volume. So the EDCs recommend that Pure solicit stakeholder feedback and written comments or redirect the RS application working group to discuss alternatives to mitigate some of these issues. Next slide, please. Yeah, I believe that concludes our presentation. For anybody interested, these are our respective contacts if needing to make an outreach to any of the persons here. Thank you.
Thank you to the team. So as I stated at the beginning, we're going to start with questions from authority staff. If we have time for stakeholder questions, we will turn to stakeholder questions that are in the queue, which you can get into using the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. But again, we're going to start with Pura questions. So I think we have Mr. Arpin up first. So we'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank the EDCs for their detailed presentation today. So I would like to start, I would ask Ms. Lupoli if she could please bring up the slides again. I would like to direct them to slide 4, please. I believe it's the slide right before this one. Thank you. So it appears that applications with the low income adder have decreased in recent months in Eversource territory. So I was wondering if Eversource could provide any insights or explanations for this recent decrease in RS low income applications.
So I would want to kind of look at the data in a little bit more detail, but we did include kind of like adder enrollment in these numbers, and there was a change from 2023 to 2024 where we are no longer doing the auto enrollment if the payee is a third party, but we are still tracking those projects. So here we kind of continued the reporting similar to what we did last year on that adder enrollment, but it could be that we're seeing that decrease just because all customers, if the payee is a third party, aren't necessarily being auto enrolled, although we are recording it. So we could still kind of see the overall application levels, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you for that. So I just wanted to clarify real quick. So are you saying that this decrease might not be evident if you included applications that were not auto-enrolled?
I think that's possible. Yeah, like I would want to check the actual program data to confirm, but that would be kind of my first guess as to what changed from last year to this year.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lupoli, could you please turn to slide 11? So my question here is, when will the ARA's data specifically be migrated to a centralized data platform? And has the timeline discussed by the EDCs in their order number 23 compliance changed at all since that was filed before the authority?
I don't think the timeline that we filed in response to the order has changed, in that we indicated that the kind of migration would be completed within 6 months of kind of kicking off work with a selected vendor or the selected vendor. And that's still the same. If anything, I think we'd like to have work completed in a shorter time frame than that. What's causing the current pause is again the surprise in what the costs would be to migrate that data, particularly given that this data is already available elsewhere. So I guess the EDCs could have just proceeded saying, well, we were ordered to do it, so cost doesn't matter, and proceeded with that, but we haven't done that. We're pausing. We're assessing if there are opportunities to do this at lower costs. And frankly, if we discover that there really aren't opportunities, it's possible that we would want to take the opportunity to again apprise PURA of what the costs of continuing to build out the PURA data dashboard would be before we proceed it. Again, we could not do that. We could just proceed to spend money and then seek recovery of it and saying, well, we're following orders. But we think it's appropriate to take a more thoughtful approach.
I appreciate that response. So when would your cost analysis be complete so that you could get started on this project? Is there a specific timeline that the EDCs had in mind here?
We're working on this diligently. I frankly hope to have a full picture of what the options are and what the costs are within the next several weeks. And then we would be making if the cost suggests it's appropriate to do so, we would be making a filing at that time, apprising the authority.
Okay, thank you. And I know that you mentioned that costs were higher than originally anticipated when you were running through the presentation, but the EDCs give a ballpark figure for what the costs are projected to be at this moment, or are you still going through the cost analysis?
Yeah, I wouldn't. The only cost information I have now was provided as part of a proposal, which is competitively sensitive, so I can't provide cost information in a public technical meeting. But in a future filing, I think we would work with council to identify a strategy in which we could provide PURA and stakeholders more insight into what the costs are. And again, we didn't have a cost expectation on this going forward. The background with development of the PURA data dashboard is its substantial development was initiated to comply with requirements in the energy affordability docket. In a prior docket, it was ordered that the EDCs select a vendor through a competitive RFP to build the PURA data dashboard to first meet a number of requirements and orders included in the energy affordability decisions or prior decision. The companies did that. The RFP did contemplate and require that the PURA data dashboard be extensible to include information from other programs, and it is. And just what we discovered when we asked the selected vendor for a quote to extend the dashboard, the costs were reasonably significant relative to the current costs, obviously, of making this same data available on the respective EDC websites.
Thank you. Are you able to discuss why those costs were significant? Did the vendor give any reasons for that?
I couldn't. That really gets more into the specifics of IT design and architecture, which I'm not expert on.
Okay, thank you. So my next question here, staying on this slide, so the EDCs had mentioned that you were considering alternative cost approaches. So I was wondering if the EDCs could discuss that in a little more detail of what alternative cost saving approaches you all have considered to date, and how those might reduce the cost of this proposal.
Again, we're relying on our IT staff to explore that, so I wouldn't be able to meaningfully explain the kind of the structure of alternatives that are being looked at.
Would UI be able to, if UIs could jump in here, are you able to add any additional context there?
No, not at this time. I will state that as UI is continuing to work through its other technical requirements to allow, for instance, Power Clerk to have developers utilize Power Clerk to get usage data up front and be able to do that. We are almost concluding, getting into the testing phase of that. So as Mr. Rice mentioned, that the IT development also has its own barriers for us that makes us have to, I guess, proceed with the current project that we have in queue and continue with that. Certainly, we've had discussions and conversations with our counterpart at Eversource in regards to the data migration opportunities, and also concur with the fact that the costs are again are part of our pause and looking at those opportunities, and we'll continue to discuss them.
Yeah, and I'll
Thank you.
I'll just come back by saying certainly in any future filing or correspondence the EDCs make, we'll make sure to, in addition, providing as much information as we can about the costs, try to provide an explanation as to what's driving those costs.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Now I would like to turn to a different topic. Ms. Lupoli, could you please turn to slide 16? So my question here is, how confident are the EDCs in the accuracy of the RS system cost data reported by applicants? And I was wondering whether the EDCs have any insights in the year-over-year increase in installation cost in Connecticut, which seem to contradict national trends.
I can jump in on this, and I'll rely on Julia and David to correct me if I misspeak, but I think our confidence is quite high on that. This is a reflection on the costs that customers are incurring for systems, because this very much matches up the system cost data that's reporting. Very consistently matches up with the pricing that's provided to the customers on customer disclosure forms in which they're signing off on. So again, I think what this is an accurate representation of what the costs that Connecticut customers are paying for PV systems. And you're correct that it seems to represent an increase over what is seen in PV markets nationally, which is why it's really prompted the EDCs to just step back and consider we might be seeing these trends simply because we're in a market in which customers can be persuaded to pay more for a PV system because the economics work out at higher costs.
Thank you for that. So would the EDCs agree then that the increase in costs is just a willingness of what customers are willing to pay rather than any specific reasoning behind the increase?
I would add that these are self-reported costs provided by the developers in regards to what customers are willing to pay. So in part that these are self-reported, they have to be seen by the willingness of what the customers are willing to pay at to be able to have these systems deployed. So the level of applications, the number of megawatts deployed certainly points to a program that is working, meeting the expected or objectives. So you have to take that into balance with the cost points that are being reported.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to slide 19, please. So in written comments, Trinity Solar stated that the equipment needed for the EDC's proposed trough alternatives is not currently available. Do the EDCs have any information regarding the accessibility of the equipment needed to complete the proposed trough alternatives?
So for the this image right here with the dual riser option, the equipment needed is essentially just a meter socket. The conduit that goes from the weatherhead to the meter socket, something that's readily available to my knowledge. So there's not any additional equipment really needed for doing this that's outside of the norm of doing any normal service work. And the advantage of this design is that it's a lot more flexible in the meter sockets that you can purchase. The challenge that triggered this alternative was the purchasing of what's called dual meter sockets or multi-gang meter sockets, which essentially is a single product that has 2 meter sockets joined together from the factory. Lead times for those sockets were a lot longer than anticipated. So purchasing these single position sockets, these sockets have a shorter lead time and are currently being used for new services today. So this design was to help alleviate the lead times for procuring a different style of meter socket.
Thank you. So would the EDCs then say that the equipment needed for these trough alternatives, not necessarily the second riser, but the other trough alternatives as well, is currently accessible for developers?
Yes, yeah, we believe so.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like Ms. Lupoli, could you please turn to slide 22? So I was wondering if the EDCs could provide any estimated cost to ratepayers if MSAs were allowed service-wide in Connecticut. I understand that the EDCs spoke with other utilities currently allowing MSAs to inform potential cost estimates. So I was wondering if the EDCs could be more specific on that.
So at this time, we don't have an exact cost estimate. Cost estimates would include additional personnel needed, IT updates, and any other process changes that we would need to go look at in depth to provide an estimate that's valuable. So at this time, I don't have an estimate to give you, but that would require a deeper dive on our part, as it does touch on a lot of different areas within the utility.
Okay, thank you. Would the EDCs be able to give like a ballpark estimate if they're not able to give a specific estimate?
Not
that
at this
still-
not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. So my next question, staying on this topic. So in its order number 32 compliance filing, UI suggested a pilot program for MSAs to gather data and operational impacts and cost. I was wondering whether Eversource would support such a pilot to obtain accurate safety and cost-related data on MSAs.
At this time, we're not entertaining the idea to pilot. We still have our concerns in terms of safety on exchanging meters and doing our normal meter work. So at this time, we're not looking to do a pilot with MSAs.
Okay, thank you. And would UI still support a pilot program for MSAs?
I believe that's I have somebody that's on that could answer to this, Mr. Nguyen, if he's available. If not, I think that we did file the opportunity for a pilot. I'm not seeing anything that has changed that.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, Ms. Lupoli, could you please turn to slide 27? So in the year 2 RES decision, PURA exempted homes built after 1980 from HES audits and approved HES audit alternatives for RES customers. Did this change alleviate this strain on the HES budget due to RS applications? And if not, could the EDCs please elaborate?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can speak to UI for a second here. I think the change, more importantly, leave the review requirements for systems, that were pre-1980. Were certainly a lot fewer in numbers. And so that accelerated the opportunities for deployment and processing times. So that was one of the more significant gains in regards to budgets. I think we continue to be challenged on the budget for HES requirements, given that participation levels of non-RES HES participants. But I'll let Ms. Danahy speak to Eversource's points.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add that I do think there is still some strain on the HES programs, although there is definitely a portion of projects that are utilizing that like built after 1980 option. And that is something that I don't kind of have the percentage off the top of my head, but that is something that we track in the portal. So it would be kind of an easy figure to pull if we were going to kind of further discuss this in written comments or working group.
Thank you. I appreciate those responses, and those are all of my questions. Thanks again, and I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So we'll continue with PURA staff questions. I'm going to go to Molly Charles and remind folks that if you are a stakeholder with a question, we will turn to you after authority staff questions. You can go ahead and get in the queue using the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And for now, we will go to Ms. Charles, please.
Yeah, thank you to the EDCs again for that presentation. So my first questions are in reference to the deployment data. Ms. Lubley, if you wouldn't mind again going to the beginning of the presentation. Thank you. So I was wondering if the EDCs could discuss what share of customers, I'm sorry, if you could just go back to the, yeah. Thank you. If the EDCs could discuss the share of customers this year that have enrolled under the netting tariff versus the BIAL tariff, and if they've seen any change from previous years, if the EDCs could discuss why that might or might not be the case.
Yes, so we do, I'm just pulling it up. We do kind of have that in this same filing. I don't think we've seen that significant of a change. It still is like vast majority netting applications versus BIAL. So looking at kind of the numbers for 2024 deployment, there's been like 57 BIAL applications total. So the volume is still relatively low, maybe a slight increase. So last year it was 75 applications total. So we're at 57 for kind of half the year instead. So maybe a slight increase, but still vast majority netting on the Eversource side.
Thank you for that. And for UI, is it similar?
Most certainly it is similar. We have a far majority of the projects are netting. And the BIAL has had a little bit of an uptick, but not significant to speak of. Again, it's numbering less than 5% of all projects for the BIALs. And so it's, again, a much lower number.
I appreciate that. Thanks. My next question is similar. If the EDCs could just discuss what share of customers have received the low income and distressed municipality adders this year. We're seeing the raw numbers here. So just wondering if there's been any change in the percentage of customers that are receiving those.
I don't think that there has been a significant change on the Eversource side. Again, I'm kind of looking at this filing that's associated. We do have the breakout by month listed there. So for, yeah, I mean, it looks a similar amount, I would say, compared to last year. So not a significant change.
For UI, the experience has been that it's been holding steady throughout its onset from 2022. It has followed or tracked the deployment levels. So when deployment levels or application submissions have reduced. So has the total volume, but the percentage points have been relatively steady throughout our participation. On the distressed municipalities, it's approaches about 40% of participation for all deployment systems.
Thank you for those responses. My next question is on slide 17, if you wouldn't mind turning to that one. Thank you. So do the EDCs have data on how average installed cost trends in Connecticut compare to national costs? Is there a source that you could point to for that?
In our
So-
comments, we referred to an annual report produced by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So that's what we looked at. And again, it was, I mean, we haven't done a deep analysis in this. We're really just stepping back and looking at the fact that there's a clear trend showing an increase in PV system pricing in Connecticut. And, you know, when we look at, again, the summary results of national studies, the trend is different.
Okay, thank you. If you could turn to slide 22, please. So have the EDCs discussed meter socket adapter approval with the state electrical inspector already?
Not yet. We've tried to reach out, but we haven't gotten a response yet. And part of what we're hoping is to hopefully have some assistance from either the EUE or PURA to get the state electrical inspector involved.
Okay, thank you. And continuing on this topic, in the EDC's April presentation to the Interconnection Working Group, the EDC stated that they plan to allow meter socket adapters with certain safety conditions. Could you just confirm that that's still the case, that the EDCs are prepared to allow MSAs if those conditions are met?
I think we still need to have a conversation with the state electrical inspector on how that would be implemented. Those are very high level requirements or contingency that we put in that could be altered depending on what our conversations are with the inspector.
Okay, thank you. And then I think that filing also discussed holding trainings with employees and municipal inspectors and developers. So I was just wondering if the EDCs had any estimate for the timeline or cost for those trainings.
Our initial proposal was to have, I don't have a timeline on that or cost. Our initial proposal was to have ConnectDR and Tesla manage the training for developers and the municipal inspectors if they were to be approved.
Okay, and then one just question on the next slide, please. So have the EDCs discussed the alternatives to MSAs with the Interconnection Working Group? And if so, how have those alternatives been received?
So this, and specifically this picture or this style of installation shown right now, this is currently allowed today. So there's nothing stopping a customer from installing an additional meter socket for the MSA for current DG installations.
Okay, and is that also the case for the two diagrams on the next slide?
Correct, yeah.
Have those been discussed with the working group then?
They have been, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then I just have one last question on slide 27, please. So could the EDCs provide a little more detail on if there's data on what share of RS customers cancel HES appointments, and if there's data on what share of RS customers pursue energy efficiency measures compared to non-RS HES customers?
For UI, certainly that data could be made available. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we do track those data points and can provide that. And it can certainly correspond or get the information from our HES implementers to look at the participation levels for non-res customers.
Okay, thank you. And does Eversource have any additional context there?
Yeah, so when we had looked at this, I believe on the Eversource side, it was about a 25% cancellation rate for those scheduled appointments. And then we should be able to pull data on the efficiency measure adoption, although I don't have that prepared at this time.
Thank you. I appreciate those responses. And I think that is all of my questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll turn to stakeholder questions in just a second. Mr. Rice, I have a very brief follow-up question from something that you discussed with my staff a little while ago. On the cost for the platform update, and I know that we need to wait for written comments for more detail, but I just wasn't clear if the costs that were so unexpected are one-time expenditures or recurring or both. And if you can't answer now, maybe that's something that we can ask for you to add to the written response as well.
I can say they're both both the one-time and the recurring costs of maintaining just the RRES program data would be a significant portion of both the kind of the upfront and the ongoing costs for to manage the RRES program as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, let's turn to stakeholder questions. I saw Attorney Wheel's hand up first.
Thank you, Chairman. Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel. I just had two questions. First, for the deployment data, I was just curious if the EDCs, in terms of comparing the deployment data to the deployment goals, do the EDCs do any kind of analysis to consider the kind of progress on a monthly basis? In other words, do the EDCs kind of look at the annual deployment goal as spread across months, or is there just sort of general tracking, like I think we've talked about in previous dockets, of maybe like halfway through the year, a sense of whether we're halfway to the deployment goal? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, the question makes sense. I would say we haven't been specifically kind of looking at a month-by-month deployment goal, but we're so far above kind of the deployment goal. I feel pretty confident that even the month-by-month would also be kind of exceed those goals, but it's not something that we have been specifically kind of looking at.
Thanks. And one follow-up on that just jumped into my head. I think it was on an Eversource slide, there was an outlier. I think March 2023 had like a remarkably higher number of applications, if I'm remembering that correctly. Do you know why? Do you have any sense of what it was about that particular month that was driving that?
To be honest, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I mean, I
don't
think I'll chime in. You know, we can't say for sure, but if you go back in time, that March 2023 was really the peak of a surge in application volume, and that coincided with a peak in supply pricing, and driven by natural gas supply shortages in the region. So I think a big part of that peak was seeing the customer response to significant rate increases at the time.
And I might add that too, that given the better weather moving into March, certainly activity levels will be increasing from the developer side as well. So however that might affect the application levels, that's something that comes from the developer side.
Okay. Thank you. My last question is just about the meter socket adapters, and it's really kind of a question for those of us who don't understand how things actually work. So it's really just for clarification. So it's my understanding that what's allowed right now, as I think Ms. Charles was just asking about, is the installation of a second socket, and the adapter can go into that second socket. But what's maybe being proposed, obviously I won't ask the companies to speak for the next presenters, but what's being proposed is a solution that where this meter socket adapter would be able to go into the singular meter socket and wouldn't necessitate a secondary installation. Am I getting that right?
Correct. They're proposing, and I know they'll speak later, but to use behind the Eversource own meter socket in the revenue metering compartment.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to ask questions, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ruthie DeWitt.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Ruthie with Posigen on the policy team. I wanted to start by asking a question on the rate setting slide. The 14% capacity factor that you have in there, is that based on the AC or DC system size?
A good question. We did pull both when we were kind of doing that analysis. I think the 14% was DC, but I would honestly want to check.
Okay,
To be
gotcha.
sure.
Yeah, just wanted to point out that the capacity factor in the model is a DC there. And then regarding the through type connections for the meeting and wiring, I just wanted to thank Eversource for your willingness to work with us on metering alternatives for multifamily and buyout projects, given the equipment challenges we face. So just wanted to note that. And then with the second risers, just wanted to say that this is Posigen's preferred alternative to the dual gang meter sockets that are in very short supply. And again, we appreciate that Eversource is continuing to allow the second riser option through 2024. And we hope that this will remain available in 2025 if needed based on the supply. And then I wanted to bring up the HES participation requirements. We are supportive of evaluating potential changes or alternatives that would serve RES program objectives without having negative impacts on the HES and HES-IE programs that have been outlined by both utilities. As an energy efficiency contractor, we will remain committed to providing energy efficiency work for all of our customers. So those are all my comments on the presentation, but I did want to bring up the model that we haven't touched much on today, and just identify some of the flags that we notice when reviewing the model. So in relation to the MACRS, just wanted to note that the federal MACRS is not available to customer-owned systems, and therefore it shouldn't be included, as this model is really based on a purchased customer-owned system rather than a TPO system. And again, for the state MACRS, this is not a real benefit that is claimed by Posigen or by tax equity investors. And that having both in there, along with the bonus depreciation, it takes away, like if you have the industry, it's an industry standard to not take bonus depreciation. So you can't take both MACRS and bonus depreciation for accounting purposes. It's always the makers. So just wanted to note that there. And then for the utility rate escalator, the model used a 3.26% average. And just wanted to note that that was calculated incorrectly. It was calculated as a straight average for each utility of the year-to-year percent changes. And that's not how a CAGR is calculated. And actually, when it's calculated properly, the same data that was presented in the model provides an actual CAGR that is below 2%. And we recommend that the original 2.5% CAGR used in 2021 and 2022 be maintained here. Those were all my comments.
Thank you very much. Did the utilities want to respond, or are we gonna leave those there? Okay. Are there other questions for the utilities based on their presentation? Okay. If not, I'll thank the utilities for their presentation, for responding to our questions. The next item on the agenda is a presentation from Tesla and Connector. I think I'm saying that right. But let me turn it over to you all for that presentation, please.
Thanks. And are you all able to share the slides for us?
We can. Give us 1 second.
Thanks.
Yes, well,
Thank you so much. And first, just want to say thanks to the authority for the ability to present at this meeting. My name's Jordan Graham, and I'm a senior policy advisor with Tesla. We worked on this and filed joint comments with Connector. John Knauer from Connector, the VP of Policy and Product Strategy, is also on this call, but he's a little under the weather today, so I'll be presenting alone, but he's here to answer questions as needed. So, slide. Thanks. So I think we're going to start with kind of a brief overview of what MSAs are. I'm going to move somewhat quickly because we've covered a lot of this in comments, and I think this has been, well documented, but just wanted to rehash it. So a meter socket adapter is a device that's installed between the meter socket and the utility meter, and basically what it does is it provides a much faster and cheaper way to install clean energy devices, although there's a number of use cases. So all MSAs have plastic housing with copper conductors, and they pass energy through from the meter through the meter socket adapter, then through the meter socket and into the home. And so it's essentially acts as an extension of the meter socket. Next slide. So the benefits of MSAs are well documented, and as noted, they help with the installation of residential solar storage systems, and these sorts of installations can require pretty complex rewiring or even the need to replace main panels or have main panel upgrades. And alleviating that need can cause significant cost savings to customers. So we're talking about anywhere from a few $100s to upwards of over $12,000 per installation in savings for customers. Some of that savings comes from actual, material savings. Some of it comes from labor. Some of it comes from the, alleviating the need to replace main panels. But part of the labor savings is that it can streamline installations from something that might take, upwards of 8 hours plus, down to something like 30 minutes. MSAs, especially, the ones that Connector and Tesla are proposing, they are certified to a number of UL standards, and they're listed to the same UL standards that utility equipment is, including, meter sockets, revenue grade electric meters, power control system devices, those sorts of things. And one of the main benefits of these is that they can really help drive decarbonization by making installations of clean energy technologies much more affordable. Next slide. And so these installers here are installers that do business in Connecticut, and they represent somewhere around 70 to 75% of residential solar and energy storage installations in the state. And they've all signed on to a letter to say that this would be immensely beneficial for their business. While Connecticut's looking for ways to incentivize installation of residential solar and storage to meet state targets, and you might be looking at it via rebates and incentives, this is a way to do it and to provide immense cost savings to customers and to really make this a more affordable technology without having to have incentives or rebates to drive that. Next slide. I should say in addition to those. So MSAs have been approved in nearly 20 states. They're used by over 40 utilities. You can see this map here. The blue states are states where it's open market, which means that we can install in all utilities there. The other states are a patchwork where some utilities have approved and some have not. It's been difficult to go kind of utility by utility to get these devices approved. We've often found pushback from certain utilities, but have ultimately been able to work with them to alleviate their concerns. And it's also why we think that regulatory approval is important to basically require utilities to adopt this proven technology. In open markets, a lot of the time it's utilities basically saying that, or it's regulators saying that any device that's submitted to a utility for approval needs to be approved within 90 days of submission. Next slide. So to recap, this is what we approved in last year's docket, and what we asked for is that any residential customer should be allowed to install a that any installer should be allowed to install a meter socket adapter as long as it meets certain minimum criteria, and that utilities should be required to assess and approve any meter socket adapter model that was submitted within 60 days. And these are best practices and are the outline by which MSAs have been approved in states like New Jersey by legislation, in Illinois by regulators, and it's very similar to what the Maryland PSC voted to approve in December. Next slide. And so then this is what PURA directed in response to our recommendation in last year's docket. And I just want to emphasize that they directed the utilities to file solutions for each safety concern and directed the EDCs to work directly with Connector and Tesla to understand how other jurisdictions have addressed MSA safety concerns. And it's worth noting that at that time, the authority said that the authority is generally inclined to allow MSAs. Next slide. So unfortunately, despite this direction, we believe that EDCs have fallen short of proposing reasonable solutions. Part of that has to do with the methodology that they have undertaken to actually assess these devices. There are over 40 utilities that have approved these devices around the US. Despite that, Eversource and UI basically engaged with 4 of the utilities. And as we note in our comments, I think one of those utilities does not allow for customer installed MSAs, and another one I actually think does not allow for any MSAs to be installed. So really, they've engaged with 2 utilities that allow for installation of customer-owned MSAs. So we think that the methodology of their analysis was incomplete. And then, we actually think that the responses were also incomplete. As we noted, PURA directed the EDCs to actually propose solutions to all safety concerns. Despite that, and despite the fact that we have provided a number of solutions to each of their concerns, we haven't seen those reflected in like iterative versions of their recommendations. I think it's fair to say that at this point, we've provided solutions to all the issues that EDCs have raised. Despite us providing these solutions, we've not seen many of our proposals adopted meaningfully or meaningfully considered by EDCs. And I'll note that Eversource particularly has not proposed reasonable alternative solutions, which we believe is antithetical to the direction that PURA provided to provide solutions for each safety concerns. One point that I want to note is that EDCs have provided no information about the scope of their problems. So like how many homes would they affect? How many homes have this sort of metering versus that sort of meter? How many homes, do you do some, do you put these voltage reading machines on? And they provided no metrics to balance their concerns with the immense benefits that we know that MSAs provide. And it's worth reminding that, scores of other utilities in the US have managed to do this despite facing the same issues that EDCs have raised. Even at this technical meeting, Eversource wouldn't commit to allowing MSAs to be installed. And Eversource is saying that we need to have future conversations with the state electrical inspector. We believe that the months, proceed and the lead up to this proceeding would have been an appropriate time to have those conversations. It's clear that they haven't initiated those conversations. And even today at this meeting, EDCs are still proposing the installation of MSAs in a second meter socket, which is not the way that MSAs are intended to be installed. It's not the way that other utilities have approved them, and we believe it's not in line with what PURA directed them to consider in November of 2023. Next slide. So despite the fact that there still is a gap in, what we believe should be approved and what the EDCs believe should be approved, we actually do agree on a number of issues. And that's, we've committed to, encouraging like an initial review of MSAs by the state electrical inspector rather than requiring the inspector to maintain a list of approved models, to conduct a training, with Connector and Tesla with municipal inspectors and relevant parties. We've agreed to a liability waiver, which is not something that is required in most states, but we agreed to do it here. We agreed to allow MSAs on single position sockets only, and also to allow other additional restrictions if aligned with MSA installation documentation. Next slide. So I just want to emphasize, a year has passed since we first came to PURA with this, and unfortunately, we don't think that we're substantively closer to EDCs approving MSAs. And so what we recommended in our comments and what we're recommending today is that we recommend that Pura should provide specific guidance to the EDCs on a process for allowing MSAs to be installed, and should provide that guidance as part of this docket. Unfortunately, absent this guidance directing EDCs to allow MSAs to be installed and to do so very soon or immediately after the conclusion of this docket, we believe that EDCs have demonstrated that they won't change their stance on these devices, which means that Connecticut residents won't get the benefit from them despite them being approved in scores of other utilities. We also reject the need for a pilot. The pilots have not been needed in other states that have approved MSAs. They've not been part of the adoption process in other states where we've seen regulatory or legislative approval of MSAs, such as New Jersey, Maryland, Illinois, and Colorado. And unfortunately, we believe that it will just unnecessarily further delay MSA approval in Connecticut. As part of this presentation, we've not gone point by point about naming all of the safety concerns that EDCs have raised and rebutting them. Those are provided in the written comments that we've provided here. They were also provided in written comments that we provided, I believe, in May. And we also provided rebuttals to a lot of that the last docket. So we didn't feel the need to go point by point here, but we're happy to answer questions. So, in conclusion, we think that direction is needed from Pura to move this forward. And thank you for your time. We're happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to start with questions from authority staff before turning to stakeholders. So we'll start with Mr. Arpin, please.
I would like to thank Tesla and Connector for that presentation today. So Ms. Lupoli, could you please turn to slide 2? So my first question is, do all MSA models provide the same benefits? And are some models inherently riskier than others?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. John Knauer here with Connector. Not exactly sure why I'm showing up as Emily's kind of registration glitch, but yeah, Mr. Arpin, to your question, first part, do they provide the same benefits? No, they don't. They're designed to support different applications, right? So the Tesla product, the backup switch is oriented around facilitating the islanding of a battery system, whereas the connector product is oriented around making the AC power connection for a rooftop PV system or an electric vehicle charger. So two devices that they're supporting very different applications, but in terms of safety, they are certified to the same standards. So in terms of the risk from their presence, the testing laboratories evaluate them according to the same criteria, view them in the same way.
Okay, thank you for that. So I just have one follow-up. So some of the operational and safety concerns highlighted by the EDCs, would Tesla and Connector believe that some of those concerns would apply to certain MSA models and not others? Or is it your opinion that those concerns just don't really apply in these cases?
I mean, without going through those concerns point by point, and I don't think they're not part of our presentation today. There are, because the products have different features, yes, in some cases they present slightly different operational concerns or what have you in the field. But all of those concerns are things that other EDCs have in other states have overcome. In places where the equipment and the infrastructure is very, very similar.
And I also just like to add on to that. I think that most of the concerns that the EDCs have raised are broadly about meter socket adapters to being installed in the main meter socket, like broadly as a class of devices. And so I think most of the concerns that they have raised are broadly applicable to meter socket adapters as a class. I think there are specific solutions that you could provide that would be model specific to the things that they've provided. So for example, when you talk about the inability to operate a bypass lever, we've provided solutions to that to EDCs that say, for our devices, we are fine with doing it this way. Hypothetically, you could have another device that would make it, a lot easier to operate the actual like lever bypass arm when you're going in to do that. And if that were the case, I think that you could potentially have a different solution, but I don't think that makes, our solutions less viable. And I think that there are a simple set of solutions that could also be broadly applied to all MSAs if desired.
And that's all part of the approval process, right? That's what other utilities do when they test and approve devices. They come up with appropriate field procedures depending on the features of the individual product. That's just common practice.
Okay, thank you for that response. Ms. Lupley, could you please turn to slide 4? So considering the strong deployment, I'm actually not sure if this is the right slide, but considering the strong deployment of RS projects to date, could Tesla and Connector elaborate a little more on what the rationale for introducing MSAs to Connecticut is at this time?
Well, we were looking at that slide in another presentation. It's like $4.50, $4.60 a watt installed cost. The rationale is to reduce that cost. It will, that is a, nationally, that is a pretty high number. I wouldn't be able to say right now exactly what sort of reduction we would see, but we would improve that number due to the reduction in the amount of electrical work that would otherwise be required.
Okay, thank you for that. So just to follow up, during the EDC's presentation, we were discussing how Connecticut's cost might reflect a willingness to pay rather than actual costs. So my question is, does Tesla and Connector have any data to suggest that the approval of MSAs have led to a measurable decrease in solar installation costs paid by the customer?
Yes, we have conducted in New York and in Maryland, and we'll have data soon from Texas demonstrating a reduction in installation cost from using the Connector product specifically. And Jordan, I'm sure, given that you have a much closer relationship to some of the installers than maybe Connector does, that you guys have that information as well.
Yeah, and the cost savings are different depending on what the what meter's being used. So if it's like an attached versus detached meter main, there are other factors that go into driving those cost savings. But yes, we've definitely looked, territory by territory and shown to what degree can you reduce installation costs on average. And then, Tesla previously had committed to providing minimum $500 savings to pass on to customers who in territories where this was installed. At this point, it's more territory specific to figure out like, okay, what is the average savings and what are we passing on to customers? But yes, we have a lot of evidence to show demonstrated savings that's passed on to customers from the approval of MSAs.
Okay, thank you for that. So my final question, I was wondering if Tesla and Connector could please summarize the extent of their discussions and interactions with the EDCs so far regarding MSA approval and how Tesla and Connector feel the discussions have gone so far.
We had some initial conversations with UI, and I'm speaking just for Connector right now. Back in November, at the first meeting with Eversource, I think in January. But I mean, for the most part, you know, as Jordan laid out in the presentation, you know, we feel like we've had a lot of conversations about possible solutions, and there are solutions. You know, the infrastructure that we're faced with in Connecticut is not meaningfully different from other markets in the Northeast where we're working, or other markets nationally where lever bypass sockets are used. So there are best practices in place here. Our biggest concern really has not been about what are ways to overcome this operationally. It's just been the unwillingness of the EDCs to actually quantify the scope of the problem. So we're told, well, you know, we're going to have this piece of equipment that we need to use in a certain circumstance. Okay, how often does that circumstance arise? And that information isn't shared. So it's been very difficult to, other than just at kind of a theoretical level, engage with solutions, because we don't understand how often the challenge that they're highlighting as a concern arises.
And I'll say, I think, you know, we initially engaged, I know Eversource on the topic of MSAs. I forget if it was late 2022 or early 2023. They balked at the idea of even assessing it at that time. We obviously went through the process of the docket. After the November order, we provided information and actual devices to the utilities to test them. And then we engaged with them, you know, basically we said, whenever you have questions, we will meet with you. We will answer them via email. And so, you know, I don't know, a couple dozen more emails back and forth between us and the utilities. And then, you know, one-on-one meetings as part of the one-on-one virtual meetings, and then also like meetings as part of the interconnection working group and prior to the interconnection working group. And basically at each stage, just trying to address each one of those concerns. Unfortunately, we've gotten to a point where I think, you know, when we're addressing their concerns, the next time that they're raised, we're hearing the same concerns, and they're not incorporating some of the solutions that we've provided into the iterative, you know, version of their solution, of their proposed solution. And so I think it's part of the reason why we've come to back to Pura and said we think we need, you know, action on this as part of this document proceeding, because otherwise I think that gap between what we're proposing and what they're proposing is going to continue to exist.
Okay, thank you for that response. So I thank Connector and Tesla again for their presentation, and I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Confirming whether Ms. Charles has any additional questions for Pura staff.
Just a couple, if you don't mind. So my first question is on slide 5, right after this one. I was wondering if the companies could just give a quick clarification of what the difference is here on the map between a partially open and open market. And it looks like there are quite a few partially open markets. So I was just wondering how Connecticut might compare to those other partially open states. in terms of MSA approval?
The open markets, I believe, are states in which all of the utilities are allow for this to be installed, or which there has been direct legislative or regulatory approval of this. The partially open markets are states where some utilities allow and some do not. That's to different degrees. For instance, in California, all of the three major investor-owned utilities allow for installation of customer-owned MSAs. But when you get down to Texas, where there's a smattering of smaller utilities, there's might be 3 or 4 utilities that allow for installation down there. In Florida, I know that there's a couple of municipal utilities that allow for installation down there, but some of the bigger investor-owned utilities don't currently allow for installation. And so, in the states that are dark, it means that there's been some sort of approval process that either at the regulatory or legislative level that allows for that, or utilities have voluntarily, jointly all allowed for installation. And in the other states, it varies.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then Ms. Lupley, if you wouldn't mind turning to slide 9. So I was just wondering if the companies could kind of summarize the alignment or misalignment between these accommodations that you agree on and the conditions for MSA approval that were previously proposed by the EDCs in the working group presentation and compliance filings, if there are any main points of agreement or disagreement.
So I think that the biggest point of disagreement that isn't highlighted on this slide is different. So a home can have a 100 amp service. Typically, that's an older size, smaller home. Newer construction, or a customer who's been able to spend the money to have their service size increased, they would have a 200 amp service. The EDCs have proposed only allowing MSAs on 200 amp services, which we believe would be, well, first of all, that's not a best practice. No other jurisdiction restricts MSA installation based on service size. And we believe that would pose challenges not only for the RES program, but also for upcoming initiatives like Solar for All, where there's a strong desire to provide benefits to LMI customers. We don't think that it would be aligned with program objectives to restrict MSAs based on service size. Otherwise, we think that there's a reasonable amount of alignment, but some of the counter proposals with installing the MSA in the second meter socket, also not a best practice, not cost effective. So we do have some points of agreement, but there are still some fairly significant points of contention that aren't highlighted here.
Thank you. And did Tesla have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the lever bypass issue has been a sticking point, and then their concerns over barriers to performance of troubleshooting for voltage complaints and using the voltage recording devices. I think those are two of the main sticking points that we've proposed solutions to both of those to EDCs, and we've outlined them in prior filings and in our most recent one as well. But I think those two are probably the ones where there's maybe the biggest gap. And then the last one is just in terms of timing of implementation, I would say as well. UI has proposed pretty long runway in terms of implementing the changes that it needs to its interconnection application portal in order to achieve this. We've not seen other EDCs having to have that sort of timeline to change their interconnection application portal. And it's not something that we believe needs to happen here. If over time the EDCs want to change their interconnection application portal to clarify this and to adopt new features, that's reasonable if they think that it's necessary. But it's not something that we've seen elsewhere. Probably not something that ratepayers need to pay, and definitely not something that needs to delay the process of implementation.
I appreciate that. And I think that is all of my questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Attorney Wheel.
Thanks again, Chairman. Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel. I don't know if you heard my last question, but I'm the guy who doesn't actually understand how stuff works. So pardon me if these are overly simplistic questions. My first question is, and I heard some of the questions from Pura staff before, so it might have already kind of answered this, but have you looked at the average cost difference specifically between the kind of the solution that is currently permitted with the secondary socket versus the proposed solution? I mean, I saw in your slide deck that the kind of range of cost savings that can be associated that the single socket solution can result in, but I'm sort of more interested in specifically how much cheaper is it to not have to put in a secondary socket, if that makes sense.
It's very difficult to say just based on a individual home assessment and what the existing conditions are, but that alone is reason not to do it, right? Like the whole point of this is to standardize the process, reduce variables, reduce complexity, and that solution increases all of those things.
Thanks. Well, that was actually kind of the answer to my second question, so I guess maybe just to confirm, is there a reason, is it cost effective to kind of go with the secondary socket solution as opposed to kind of a traditional solution, which as I understand it is just sort of installing two separate meters altogether? I mean, I imagine there's some savings between them, but in your opinion, does it make sense for a consumer to consider the solution where you install a secondary socket just for the sake of putting an adapter in it, as opposed to other maybe more traditional solutions?
No, it doesn't. I mean, for the homeowner, it increases the complexity. It would be for the homeowner, it would be better in that case to just avoid, at least in terms of the connector product, to just spend a bunch more money and not use it at all, because it's just increasing variability, increasing.
Okay, thanks. My last question is, is not sure whether Tesla and Connector are aware, but we in Connecticut, our largest utility still is on AMR meters, and there's sort of an ongoing discussion about when we're eventually going to shift to AMI. If that shift happened, like subsequent to an installation of a connector meter socket, would there need to be, would the meter socket still work? Would there need to be any kind of update to that installation if an AMR meter were replaced with an AMI meter?
Meter socket adapters, and this is a universal statement, are agnostic as to the type of meter that's plugged into them. A lot of the concerns that the EDCs have around procedure for these devices are closely linked to, if not completely driven by, the fact that they still use AMR meters. So the need to go out and do a meter exchange when someone installs solar, that isn't something that most other utilities have to do, right? A lot of the monitoring equipment also AMI reduces the burden there. So yes, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing with the Connecticut EDCs around procedural things stem from that.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks again.
And I second everything Connector has said, and including the fact that a second meter solution for these, whether that's a dummy meter or an actual meter, largely mitigates or I should say largely eliminates the cost savings associated with meter socket adapter.
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Chairman, for the chance to ask the question.
Of course, thank you. Stephen Burt, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any further questions or comments on the meter issues, but did want to just quickly take the opportunity to emphasize a few points that we have made in our written exceptions of last year and our comments from last month. We're always oriented around the RS program objectives when we're making these comments and thinking through how we want to respond to the invitation to add our thoughts. And the residential tariff model is critical to us, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments about that. Kind of building on what Ruthie had already said, the reason why we think it's important to not include the makers and bonus depreciation is, generally speaking, given that the model is based on a customer purchase system, we just want to be sure that we're all sensitive to what happens when you incorporate TPO specific inputs and assumptions into that model. It skews it in a direction that isn't really a base case any longer. So that's the reason behind that, is we're concerned that using those inputs is going to push the base case against the achieving of the program objectives. So just wanted to put that in context. The other thing I wanted to mention is the model should continue to use the 30% ITC. There's been some discussion and commentary about the additional added benefits that the Inflation Reduction Act made available. But they're too kind of uncertain to be part of a base case. If you include those elements, it kind of creates an assumption that folks are going to be eligible for those additional credits, and that's not the case. I mean, what's been shown so far is that the Energy Communities credit currently only applies to 2 counties in Connecticut. The annual update could mean that next year they don't qualify. We've already experienced that kind of uncertainty with, over the course of 1 year, certain areas qualifying, then not qualifying. The low-income communities bonus credit, it's only available at certain times of the year. It's got limited capacity. It's nothing that you can really count on, and certainly shouldn't be included as part of the base case. And then the domestic content bonus credit, most, if not all, residential projects that we've deployed and that we're aware of have not claimed the credit. So just want to emphasize again, in an effort to remain useful, we think that base case should continue to rely on the 30% ITC, but not the additional adders. And then the other element I wanted to take the opportunity to mention is on Solar for All, if that's all right. We want to emphasize again what's in our comments, and that is that the funding should be opt-in instead of being mixed with state funding. If you mix it with state funding, you're going to have folks who may not be able to meet the requirements of the federal funding, and it could really invade the objectives of the program, of the state's goals. So we're really looking forward to participating in the stakeholder sessions, but want to emphasize that point again, that maintaining the separation between the two is going to help each achieve its objectives. So those are the items I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. Bronte Payne, do you have general comments, or do you have questions on our presentation, please?
I had a comment and related to the Tesla and connector presentation, and then some general comments, if that's okay.
Okay, please.
Thank you. So Bronte Payne with SunPower. I'm a senior policy manager. First, I wanted to say this is also in our written comments, but we're supportive of the proposals put forward by Connector and Tesla. And, I think they both touched on this, but to reinforce the importance of it. The benefits of meter socket adapters are really that they can help all consumers reduce the cost. That can be particularly beneficial for low-income customers that we would like to see be able to adopt solar more easily. I think there's a really large benefit there. That would be helpful if the utilities were able to streamline some of these processes and particularly adopt the proposals put forward by Connector and Tesla. And then just in relation to Steve Burt's comments on the bonus credits in terms of how to look at the residential tariff model, to add a finer point on it, on what he was saying on energy communities, that update will happen in May of every year. So it will happen just in the middle of every single RRES cycle, which really limits the visibility that any of us would have into the availability of that bonus credit in particular, when it comes to which geographies in Connecticut will be eligible.
Great, thank you. I'm looking for questions on the presentation we received. Christopher Kellogg.
Yes. I have several questions of John and Jordan related to the presentation. There seems to be a differing opinion related to safety protocols when removing the connector versus the Tesla device. As you know, we have a large percentage of bypass sockets in our service territory, and that has been in place as a requirement for more than 20 years. A Connector is stating that obviously to safely remove the device, you would have to have a customer outage, and Tesla has not really weighed in or indicated that. If we have to be out for a meter exchange to install a bidirectional meter, that would ultimately require customer appointments or customer outages, although potentially brief, but somebody would have to be present. Can you elaborate on the positions between Tesla and Connector related to the removal of the meter and how that would be done when there's a bypass meter socket in place?
So, Chris, you have our product manual, and the procedure for how to install the device and how to work with the meter is clearly laid out in that manual. So yes, the documented procedure for doing this is that the main breaker in the home should be set to the off position to drop load prior to conducting a meter exchange.
All right, thank you, John. And I don't recall seeing that in Tesla's write-up, so there is somewhat of a difference.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify. Thank you for the question. We've tried to have conversations with EDCs to say if there are ways to avoid that, and you think that can be done safely, and that the lever bypass switch can be pulled, with the meter socket adapter in place, which we believe that it can, and we've demonstrated that in other territories, that's the preferred method for doing so. If the EDCs believe that the lever bypass cannot be pulled safely, given the installation of the MSA, we think it's fine to do exactly what Connector just said, which is to coordinate with the customer to cut load to the home. And that would also be an acceptable solution to that. Our understanding is that would be the solution that'd be currently in place too for any customer that does not have a lever bypass socket installed in Connecticut. So we believe that there should be processes in place for the EDCs to already do this sort of coordination with customers. And if ultimately that's the stance the utility need to take, that the lever bypass cannot be pulled safely with the MSA installed, that we're okay with going that route.
Having said that, is there an opinion from either company related to scheduling these appointments and the added costs. Obviously, we attempt to install these in the most efficient manner, but scheduling appointments potentially would slow us down and change staffing needs to meet those appointments. Has there been any similar discussions or opinions from either company related to that matter?
I'm not exactly sure how to. What exactly is your question, Chris? I'm sorry.
My question,
if we have an opinion on.
Well, obviously, if we're the question is pretty straightforward, I think, and sorry if I wasn't clear. The question is, if we're required to have the customer operate their main breaker and disconnect service, that would mean somebody has to be present, which potentially increases appointments and time on the site, and not necessarily going in the most efficient manner of installs, which could potentially cause delays in those installs. So I'm wondering if there's an opinion, or if you've run into that in other utilities, and how do they deal with that?
Well, I don't think we've run into it that frequently with other utilities, because most utilities aren't doing meter exchanges as a precondition of PTO. That said, I think I saw in an earlier slide as part of that there's like, 3 to 4 business day turnaround on a meter exchange. I don't see much reason for the initial exchange to fall too far outside of that window. I think the customer is going to have a lot of motivation to get their system online, and I think that coordinating that initial meter exchange is just something that the installers are going to have to communicate to the homeowners, and it's going to become part of the workflow. I don't see it as a huge barrier, because the customer is going to have incentive to be around so that their system can start producing.
Right. I think the number of appointments is what I'm alluding is going to change how we do the work, and the staffing that's required to do the work in order to keep those appointments, because it changes how you lay that out without having access to the bypasses. So that was my point.
And I appreciate that point, and I would like to see some more information and more quantification about what you think that's actually going to take. Right. I think that's what we were hoping to achieve in the previous docket.
Yeah, John, it's difficult to tell the percentage of bypass sockets that are out there. As I've said, we've been doing it for 20 years. That's been the standard. So having said that, it's not like we're able to determine how many of those exists on customer sites without conducting field audits. So it's not clear how many are out there. I would expect that there's quite a large number, but it's difficult for us to answer that question.
Sure, but whether it's a lever bypass socket or not, the procedure from our perspective is going to be the same, right? The customer needs to be home to shed load. So I'm not sure from the perspective of how Eversource designs their process, whether you even want to know, right? You just want to plan on the homeowner being home so that someone is there to shed load if it's necessary. But unless the solar installer somehow communicates to you as part of the, well, even then it doesn't matter. I think that you're going to wind up following the same process, whether it's a bypass socket or whether it's some kind of legacy design.
And that's our take too, is that, I mean, the utilities clearly have processes in place to already do this. We're happy to just kind of make that process standardized regardless of whether or not a customer has the lever bypass meter in terms of these installations. We think that these sorts of schedulings, you know, the utilities have proven they can be done. If there need to be more of them, that's fine. We've not seen any data to understand what the scope of the problem is in terms of how many lever bypass versus not lever bypass meters there are out there. You know, what would be like an action, whether or not there would actually be a slowdown associated with the scheduling of these appointments. We've provided solutions for if the utilities want to use the lever bypass switch with the Tesla meter socket, the backup switch, or without. And so to our thinking, we've kind of covered a lot of the potential solutions that could be provided there. I think it kind of underscores one of our ongoing frustrations with this, which is that we think we've provided a number of different ways to make this work. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've asked the authority to move forward with this.
And just one additional point is with the bypass access today that we're able to conduct a meter exchange without the customer interruption. My second question is related to John's comment in the presentation related to the limiting it to 200 amps. Can you clarify what is meant by that? Are you saying 200 amps or less or anything greater than 200 amps? Because my understanding devices are rated for 200 amps. Did I miss something?
They're rated for up to 200 amps.
Okay, so
yeah, the point was to allow it on any service up to 200 amps.
okay, I don't think we have a disagreement there then if that's the case on that point, but I just wanted to raise that.
Okay, thank you. We are at time in terms of today's technical meeting. So I'm gonna move us on in our agenda. Appreciate the presentation from Tesla and Connector and the discussion we've had today. So let's turn back to our agenda. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands next steps for this docket, which are available in the procedural calendar for this docket. We have another technical meeting scheduled, just coming up quickly on August 7th. The notice of technical meeting is already published. So the technical meeting topics for August 7th are available in that notice. We have asked for presentations on proposed program manual updates, application fees, updated meter wiring diagrams. So I'll make sure that everyone comes prepared to discuss those three topics at the August 7th technical meeting. And that is the next step in this docket. We do have draft decisions scheduled for mid-September. With that, I'll take any clarifying questions or administrative matters before we move towards adjournment. All right. If there are none, I want to thank everyone for participating in this morning's technical meeting, and we will see everyone back for this docket virtually on August 7th. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.